adventurers and rangers all. Here we are for the 2nd of July's Tales for Families. And these are shape-shifting tales, so they're tales about things that maybe look one way but not quite that way. They look a slightly different way. Or they maybe changed their shape, or they were humans and they became animals like Selkies, the seal people. This one's a little bit different. This one's about some trees, and it's called Jack and the Dancing Trees, and it comes from this book here. It's called Dancing with Trees, and it is by Alison Galbraith and Alette Willis. Now, when you look at trees, you don't think they move much, do you? But are you so sure? Like I said, the person in this story is called Jack. There are many stories about Jack, aren't there? There's Jack and the Beanstalk, Jack and the Giant Killer, Jack who went up the hill to fetch a pail of water along with his sister Jill. If you think about it, there are lots and lots of stories about Jack. That's because in stories, Jack's just a name for a boy. Just like maybe Janet or Jill would just be a name for a girl. So, the story is about a boy named Jack. But it could be any boy you know, really. Could even be you. Now Jack lived on a farm. He didn't own the farm, no, he worked for the farmer. The farmer, well, he wasn't a particularly nice man to work for, to be honest. He made Jack work very, very hard for not very much money. But Jack lived with his mother, and his mother was very resourceful. So she was able to go out into the hedgerows and get berries and fruit and mushrooms and food from the forest for them to eat. And then Jack could buy oats and wheat and corn and things at the market and maybe a little bit of meat with his earnings. So they got by fine. And there was one thing, because she was a very resourceful woman, like I say, so she used to make do with very little. She had a few rules, and one of those funny rules, which Jack was never really sure about, was that you should always have a bit of string in your pocket, because you never really know when it might come in handy. And so Jack just always did this. So he lived with his mother. He would do the housework and help her look after the house, and she would go out and get food from the forest where she could, and he would make up the rest with what he earned from the farm. And the other thing that you should know about Jack is there was a milkmaid who worked on the farm called Jenny. He loved Jenny very much. And he hoped that one day they would become husband and wife. And Jenny, she felt the same way too, which is good, isn't it? Good for Jack and for Jenny. And so the problem is that in order for Jack to have his own house, and for he and Jenny to have the life that he wanted and that he felt that Jenny deserved, he was going to have to save up a lot of money. And like I say, there wasn't a lot of money to go round. And so he was sat one day in the fields watching the farmer's sheep when he was thinking about this problem, and he started to hear the birds talking. Now, not many people can understand birds, but Jack's mother had taught him how to listen to the birds, understand the different sounds they made, and work out what they were saying. Now, the other thing you should know is that this was Midsummer's Eve. That means that night was going to be the shortest night, and it would be the longest day. So the day when there was the most amount of sunshine. And so, whilst Jack was sat there in the field, taking in the sun and watching the sheep and pondering over this problem, he heard the birds, and he heard what the birds were saying. "Tonight's the night," they twittered. "Oh, yes," said the crows. "Tonight's the night." "Wonder what the night is," thought Jack. "Tonight's the night when the trees they dance without a thought for us, and where we will sleep," said the birds. "We will have to sleep in the barns," said the crows, "along with the owls if they will let us." but tonight's the night the trees will dance. Well, Jack thought it was most peculiar, but he did know that on Midsummer's Night, magical things did happen. And so when he went home and he told his mother about this, his mother said, "Oh yes, I have heard tell of that. It only happens every 100 years. It's quite a long time, isn't it? Every 100 years, the trees, the biggest oak tree in particular, uproots itself and they go dancing down the hills and through the valleys and around the village. And everybody just stays asleep because the trees, they're quite big and they cause quite a bit of havoc. And so it's best not to get in their way. But what is in the holes that the trees' roots leave is many, many gems and diamonds and emeralds and rubies and gold and jewellery that nobody has ever seen, jewellery forged by the dwarves deep in the earth. It's a magical sight. And if you're lucky enough, you could make your fortune that way. But you have to be careful, because if the trees were to come back and put their roots back down in the ground, well, you'd be trapped under there forever, wouldn't you? So Jack got to thinking. Well, now this would be a good way to raise a little bit of money, wouldn't it? So that he could buy his own house and he and Jenny could live together. Good idea, yeah? That's what Jack thought. And so, on Midsummer's Eve, when the sun finally set and spread its colours out into the world, its reds and yellows and oranges, purples and blues, spread out into the fields of wildflowers, Jack crept back up onto the hill where the big oak tree stood. And sure enough, when there was no sun to be seen anymore, a creaking and a groaning and a swaying from the trees and a squawking from the crows as they rose up from the branches, the trees began to move, stretching out their roots. Their enormous big roots. It was the oak tree first, like I say. That tree rose up out of the ground, hundreds of years old. And then beside it, the spindly silver birches with their white, flaky bark. They too danced beside it, lifted themselves out of the ground. And there was the ash. There was the chestnut. And they danced and twirled and jigged all the way down the hill and through the valley until Jack could not see them anymore. And he was going to follow because he knew they must go back down into the village. But then he saw something sparkling in the moonlight in one of the biggest holes that the oak tree had left. And he heard a grunting and a huffing and a puffing. He thought, wonder what that is. Was somebody trapped beneath the tree? So he goes up and he sees the farmer, his boss. He sees his farmer down in the hole, filling up a sack full of gold as fast as he can. And Jack thought, well, if it's good enough for him, then this is definitely what I need to do. And he went off to see where the birch tree was, where the hole had been left there. And he looked down and he saw that there was some gold and there was some jewels down there. And there, right down at the bottom, was the most beautiful diamond ring that he could give Jenny. And so he jumped down into the hole, but once he was down the bottom there, he realised that actually it was a much bigger hole than he thought it was. But he thought, well, while I'm down here, I shall start to collect some gold and some jewels. And he thought of the emeralds and the rubies that he could give his mother so that then he'd never go hungry again and they could fix that hole in the roof. And he started to fill up his pockets, and he even had a small bag in one of them that he could fill up as well. And he took that diamond ring for Jenny. And then he saw the light was returning to the world. What was he going to do? The trees would be back soon and he couldn't see a way to get out of that hole. And then he heard a familiar voice. Jack! Jack! It was Jenny. Jenny had heard of Jack's plan, and she was a little worried because she'd heard of what would happen if he was still down the hole when the trees returned, and she did not want to lose her Jack. And she looked down at the hole. She said, "Jack, you need to come out quick. It's getting light and the trees, I can see them dancing their way back up the hill." And now Jack started to feel the earth rumble and the soil began to tumble down the sides of the hole. He thought, how am I going to get out? Couldn't get any grip with his hands. And then he remembered. He remembered that string that his mother had always said you should carry in your pocket. And he thought, I wonder if it's long enough. He pulled out that string and he threw it up to Jenny and he said, "Here, catch, Jenny." And she did. It was just long enough. And he was able to pull himself out, hand over hand, and push his feet against the sides of the hole the birch tree had left. And he raised himself up out of the hole. And once he was on the side, he could see that the farmer who owned the farm, his boss, had not managed to get out of the hole yet. And so he ran across to the hole and he said, "Here, quick, grab the string, pull yourself out," because Jack was a good lad. Even though this farmer had not treated him well, he would not want to see him squashed by a tree. But the farmer was not listening. He was too busy muttering to himself, counting the gold, 100, 2, 100, 3, 100, and he was putting it all into the sack. He wanted as much as he could get. Jack was only just in time to move back from the hole before the oak tree arrived once more and dug its roots back into the ground and down on top of the farmer. The farmer was never seen again. Only Jack and Jenny knew what had happened to him. The farm passed to the farmer's son, who was a much nicer boss, and in fact, because he knew that Jack wished to marry Jenny, gave Jack a house on the outskirts of the farm. It was kind of him. And Jack was able to give most of the money that he had collected from the birch tree hole. He managed to give that to his mother so his mother could live very well and do up the house nicely. Never had to go foraging again. And, of course, that ring went to Jenny. And Jack and Jenny were married. They lived very happily ever after. I hope you enjoyed that story. I love the idea that the trees come alive and start dancing at night. Do you think the trees do that? Of course, they would never wish us any harm. The trees always give to us, don't they? Even when we cut them down, they still give to us by giving us fire and paper and books. Trees are very special, and I think this story shows you that. So next time you see an enormous big old oak tree, don't forget what adventures it gets up to every 100 years on Midsummer's Eve. I'll see you next month. Take care, and may your month be full of stories. Toodle pip.